Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has now formally congratulated the Russian President Vladimir Putin on his re-election. Russian electoral officials said Putin was re-elected with around 87% of the vote. Western nations have condemned the election, saying they do not believe it was free and fair. Currently in Russia, people are not allowed to criticize the invasion of Ukraine. The opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, died or was killed in prison just before the election. Musa Mdunge is a political analyst based at the University of Dundee in the UK. Musa, good afternoon to you. This may in fact be quite a tough question. Should President Ramaphosa have congratulated President Putin in this way?
Thank you so much, Stephen, for having me, and good afternoon to your viewers. Well, look, I mean, in the name of international diplomacy, when an election has been run and a winner has been announced, it is conventional that other heads of states and governments will congratulate that particular leader. Now, whether it was right for Cyril Ramaphosa to make that move, it depends on what perspective and side you sit on in terms of this relationship. If you believe that, relations of the global south are critical and important in reshaping the world and the international system, then Ramaphosa's move is quite in line with that, in building that solidarity among the global south, or, what is known as South-South cooperation. And given that these two countries are effectively partners in BRICS, and they are partners in many other institutions, such as the G20, other organizations such as the G20, it was unlikely that the president would take a decision other than congratulating his counterpart in Russia, given also the fact that he himself faces elections later on. And it must be seen from that perspective that it is about building closer relations. But of course, the question then becomes, in a day such as this, how does South Africa balance its closeness with Russia, given the accusations of human rights violations over the years, particularly under Vladimir Putin's presidency?
Musa, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment, and I do apologize. As you can see on your screen, the breaking news now, confirmation. We understand that Marcus Jooste, the person believed by many to be behind the accounting scandal at Steinhoff, the biggest accounting scandal, in fact, in our history, from what we can see, from what we're told, has now taken his own life. We understand that this was during some kind of arrest incident involving officials. Earlier this week, you may remember, the Financial Fiscal Commission had issued a fine of 475 million rand, a financial penalty, because of what they said were the lies that he had uttered and committed during the Steinhoff probe, during the Steinhoff collapse. So, confirmation in that breaking news there that Marcus Jooste, we understand, is now dead, has in fact passed away at his own hand. We will have more reaction to this and more developments. Of course, it is a story just coming through to us. Musa Mdunge, let's for the moment just continue this conversation around Russia, and realize these are two sort of very different conversations. But the situation with Russia is interesting because I think we as South Africans have a view or an understanding of what a free and fair election is, and perhaps it may be worth asking if you think South Africans would see a Russian election as free and fair. We're very used to, for example, the right to freedom of expression. I don't think that happens in Russia.
Indeed, and this is the challenge for South Africa's foreign policy, and one that is, in fact, grappling even my mind as I do my PhD, is this issue of how does South Africa, a country that is fundamentally anchored around human rights, in fact, the late Alfred Nzo was the former foreign affairs minister, the first foreign affairs minister in South Africa, said that we would spread democracy and human rights across the four corners of the world. Unfortunately, as idealistic as that pronouncement has been, the moment South Africa's new leaders were met with the reality of South Africa's own economic situation, the need to meet its needs, the challenges in the continent, then there was somewhat of a reframing of its commitment around human rights, where it is seen that we ought to broaden our scope in looking at human rights to include the attainment of economic rights. And this is where I think Russia and South Africa find synergy, and why South Africa seeks to justify its relationship. Because it seeks to say that it is key, fundamental, that South Africa, in meeting its own human rights obligation to its own people, ought to ensure that it builds as many relations it can around the world that will produce economic dividends in the form of investments and trade. And South Africa can make an ethical, perhaps a moral argument from that perspective. But the question then becomes, given its stance on issues such as Palestine, Israel, where if we were to take these two conflicts and freeze perhaps the historical context around them and the fact that they are unique between themselves, fundamentally you have one state encroaching on the territorial independence of another. And if South Africa sees it fit to criticize Israel in its invasion and the kind of operation it has in the Gaza Strip, the question must be posed, why can you not do that with its fellow compatriots in Russia, whom, by the way, the ICC has already charged many of its senior military and political leaders for human rights violations, the same way South Africa has taken Israel to the ICJ on similar grounds. So there's an inconsistency in South Africa's foreign policy and an inability, I believe, by our political leaders to communicate a cohesive foreign policy. And that's the challenge South Africa finds itself.
Are we any different from other countries? The United States says it fights for democracy. It invaded Iraq. It's invaded other countries. It supports Israel. It says it sticks up for human rights. It supports Israel. Britain says that it supports human rights too. I don't know how Argentina would see the Falklands. There are other examples. Are we any different from anywhere else?
Indeed, you ask a very pointed question here to say, if South Africa is so inconsistent in its foreign policy, is it isolated? And the truth, Stephen, is it is not. As you've pointed out, the West have their own contradictions in foreign policy and inconsistencies in foreign policy, as do the guys in the United Kingdom, the European Union, and other G7 countries. And this is largely because you'll always have a conflict of interest. And unfortunately, that finds itself in a space of limited options, limited resources. Even countries as huge, as well-resourced as the United States have seen that their own military-industrial complex has limits, especially when it comes to nation building. They saw that in Iraq. They saw that in Afghanistan. And South Africa, in the same way, as a middle power, I would argue as a regional power, is also limited in its scope, in the resources it can employ, in the execution of what would be seen as a human rights foreign policy. But, Stephen, I would argue this, that there are examples that South Africa could look to. And these examples, we'll find them in the Nordic countries, who, small as they are, have really played a critical role in international relations, particularly on the issue of non-alignment. And I think that's where lies South Africa's potential strength, is that if it truly positions itself as a non-aligned country, it can position itself in a place where it can play a role in helping find resolution around these conflicts. That I've always believed is South Africa's strong power, its soft power, where it can really pull the global south towards supporting peace in both the Middle East as well as the conflict going on in Ukraine. But unfortunately, do we have the political will? And that's the question that South Africans have got to ask themselves. As South Africa continues to shift, as our own economic challenges continue to limit our scope to influence international events and international organizations, how will South Africa position itself in foreign policy in the next 25 years, where at the core, Stephen, of our foreign policy must be the full attainment of economic freedom for our people, but this cannot happen in isolation. And South Africa understands this, that unless you have a region that is in peace within itself, a continent at peace with itself, and a globe at peace with itself, economic development cannot find a conducive environment. And that is why foreign policy matters. And that is why foreign policy ought not to be underestimated, even in these elections. It matters what parties believe on foreign policy, because that has direct implications about how countries see South Africa, and how they see South Africa impacts the investment decisions they will make. And that, Stephen, is really the core of the matter here. Has our foreign policy served our economic agenda? And I would argue that the jury is still out.
Musa Mdunge, thank you. Political analyst based at the University of Dundee in the UK. Really appreciate that time.